In August of 2016, 28-year-old photography student Jessica Palmer drove her silver Honda Civic into the parking area of Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area, Nevada, with plans to capture sunrise photographs for her graduate portfolio at the University of Nevada. She had told her roommate Amanda that she would return by Sunday evening, but when Monday morning arrived and Jessica's bed remained untouched, Amanda knew something was wrong. The same afternoon, she contacted the Clark County Sheriff's Office to report her missing. 3 weeks of intensive searching across the desert landscape yielded nothing. 4 months later, when a rock climbing instructor spotted what appeared to be clothing caught high in the branches of an ancient Joshua tree nearly 2 miles from any established trail, he had no idea he was looking at the first evidence in a case that would reveal how quickly trust can become deadly in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert. The morning of August 12, 2016, dawned clear and unusually cool for mid-August in the Mojave Desert. According to the National Weather Service station in Las Vegas, the temperature at 5:30 in the morning was 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which Jessica Palmer considered perfect conditions for the landscape photography she had planned. The parking attendant at the Red Rock Canyon Visitor Center later testified that Jessica's silver Honda Civic arrived at approximately 5:45 in the morning, one of the first vehicles of the day. The car was parked neatly in a standard space near the information kiosk, with no signs of hurried arrival or distress. According to the same attendant, Jessica appeared calm and prepared, carrying a professional camera bag and a small hiking backpack. She stopped briefly at the trail map display, studying the routes for several minutes before heading toward the Calico Tanks Trail, a moderate hiking path known for its photographic opportunities during golden hour lighting. Jessica Palmer was a dedicated graduate student in the Fine Arts Photography program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her professors described her as methodical and safety-conscious, someone who researched locations thoroughly before venturing out alone. She had been working on a series documenting the intersection of human development and desert wilderness, focusing on how morning and evening light revealed details invisible during the harsh midday sun. Her advisor, Professor Linda Garrett, later confirmed that Jessica had discussed this specific shoot during their meeting the previous week, explaining her intention to photograph the contrast between the red sandstone formations and the distant Las Vegas skyline. According to her detailed notes found later in her apartment, Jessica planned to hike approximately 2 miles along the established trail, then explore several unmarked areas where she believed she could capture unique perspectives of the rock formations. The Calico Tanks Trail begins as a well-maintained path through typical Mojave Desert terrain, winding between creosote bushes and barrel cacti before ascending toward the distinctive red and white sandstone cliffs that give Red Rock Canyon its name. In August, even during the cooler morning hours, the trail requires careful attention to hydration and sun protection. Jessica was well prepared for these conditions, carrying 3 bottles of water, a wide-brimmed hat, and high SPF sunscreen. Her camera equipment included a professional DSLR with multiple lenses, a sturdy tripod, and extra batteries. Everything suggested a photographer who understood both her craft and the environment she was entering. At approximately 7:15 in the morning, according to a family from Phoenix who were hiking the same trail, Jessica was photographing near a distinctive rock formation about 1 mile from the trailhead. The family remembered her because she politely asked them to wait a moment while she completed a long exposure shot of the morning light on the canyon walls. The father of the family later told investigators that Jessica appeared confident and comfortable, mentioning that she had hiked in desert conditions before. She was alone at that time, and the family continued on their planned route while Jessica remained at the photography location. This was the last confirmed sighting of Jessica Palmer by independent witnesses. The trail Jessica had chosen was considered safe for solo hikers during daylight hours, with clear markers and regular foot traffic from tourists and local outdoor enthusiasts. However, the areas beyond the established trail presented different challenges. The terrain became increasingly rugged, with loose rock, hidden crevices, and limited visibility between the towering sandstone formations. More importantly, cell phone coverage became sporadic or non-existent once hikers moved away from the main trail corridor. Jessica's phone records, obtained later during the investigation, showed her last successful call connection at 8:42 in the morning, when her device briefly connected to a tower serving the Red Rock Canyon area. After that time, no further activity was recorded. By noon on August 12, the temperature had risen to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for August in southern Nevada but dangerous for anyone caught without adequate shelter or water. Jessica had planned to complete her photography session and return to her car before the heat became severe, but she never appeared in the parking area. Her Honda Civic remained in the same space where the attendant had seen it that morning, doors locked and showing no signs of disturbance. When evening arrived and the car was still there, the park rangers began to take notice, though they did not yet consider it an emergency situation. Many photographers and hikers occasionally stayed later than planned, and vehicles sometimes remained overnight when people decided to camp or extend their visits. The alarm was raised on Monday morning, August 13th, when Jessica failed to appear for her teaching assistant duties at the university. Professor Garrett attempted to reach Jessica by phone throughout the morning, but each call went directly to voicemail. When Jessica's roommate Amanda confirmed that Jessica had not returned home and that her car was missing, Professor Garrett immediately contacted the university security office. By noon, Amanda had driven to Red Rock Canyon and located Jessica's Honda Civic still parked in the same space. The sight of the car, sitting alone under the blazing desert sun with no sign of its owner, prompted Amanda to call the Clark County Sheriff's Office and request immediate assistance. The initial search began that same afternoon, despite the dangerous heat conditions. Clark County search and rescue teams, assisted by National Park Service rangers and volunteer groups, focused their efforts along the Calico Tanks Trail and its immediate surroundings. The search teams used a systematic grid pattern, covering the established trail first, then expanding into the unmarked areas where Jessica might have wandered while seeking photographic subjects. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the broader area, looking for any signs of heat signatures that might indicate a person in distress. Ground teams called Jessica's name repeatedly and used air horns to signal their presence, hoping she might be injured but conscious somewhere among the rock formations. The desert environment presented unique challenges for the search operation. During daylight hours, the extreme heat made extended ground searches dangerous for the rescue teams themselves. The rocky terrain created numerous blind spots and hidden areas where someone could be trapped or concealed. Most critically, the vast scale of the desert meant that a person could be relatively close to help but completely invisible from even a short distance away. The search coordinators noted in their reports that Red Rock Canyon's landscape could easily hide someone who had fallen into a crevice, become trapped behind a rock formation, or simply collapsed in an area shielded from aerial view. On the second day of searching, the teams expanded their coverage area to include regions further from the established trails. They discovered several areas where the sandy soil showed recent foot traffic, but none of the tracks could be definitively linked to Jessica. The desert wind and the passage of other hikers had obscured most useful details. Search dogs were brought in on the third day, but the extreme heat and the age of any scent trail made their efforts largely unsuccessful. The dogs showed interest in several locations along the main trail, consistent with Jessica's confirmed presence there, but they could not establish a clear direction of travel beyond the point where she had been photographed by the Phoenix family. As the first week of searching concluded, the operation had covered more than 50 square miles of desert terrain. Teams had explored every accessible canyon, examined every visible cave or overhang, and investigated every area where someone might seek shelter from the sun. They found no trace of Jessica Palmer. No discarded clothing, no dropped camera equipment, no footprints leading away from the established trails. The absence of any physical evidence was particularly puzzling to the search coordinators, who noted that even experienced desert hikers typically leave some trace of their passage. The complete lack of clues suggested either that Jessica had traveled much further than anyone expected, or that something had prevented her from following normal patterns of movement through the landscape. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the official operation was scaled back to periodic sweeps and follow-up investigations of any reported sightings. Jessica's car was impounded for forensic examination, but the interior revealed nothing unusual. Her camera bag and hiking equipment were missing, consistent with her having taken them on the trail. Her purse, containing her wallet and identification, was locked in the glove compartment, suggesting she had not planned to be away from her vehicle for an extended period. The keys were never found, leading investigators to conclude that Jessica had taken them with her, probably in her backpack along with her photography equipment. The case was officially classified as a missing person under unknown circumstances, a designation that left open the possibility of accident, medical emergency, or foul play. Jessica's family, who had traveled from their home in Oregon, continued their own search efforts for several additional weeks. They hired a private investigator and organized volunteer groups to cover areas that the official search teams might have missed. Local media coverage brought attention to the case, and several reported sightings were investigated, but none proved to be credible. As autumn arrived in the desert and temperatures became more moderate, the intensive search efforts gradually diminished, though the case remained open and active in the sheriff's department files. 4 months had passed since the intensive search operation in Red Rock Canyon was officially suspended. Jessica Palmer's case remained in the active files of the Clark County Sheriff's Department, but with no new leads or evidence, the investigation had reached what detectives privately called a cold standstill. Her family had returned to Oregon after exhausting their resources on private search efforts, though they maintained regular contact with the assigned detective and continued to hope for any development that might explain their daughter's disappearance. The desert had seemingly swallowed Jessica without leaving the smallest trace, a phenomenon that, while not unprecedented in the vast Nevada wilderness, remained deeply troubling to everyone involved in the search efforts. December in the Mojave Desert brings a dramatic transformation from the scorching summer months. Temperatures drop to comfortable levels for outdoor activities, and the clear, dry air provides exceptional visibility across the landscape. It was during this season that Red Rock Canyon experiences some of its heaviest visitation from rock climbers, who travel from across the country to tackle the area's challenging sandstone walls. The cooler weather allows for extended climbing sessions, and the stable atmospheric conditions create ideal circumstances for both beginners learning basic techniques and experienced climbers attempting difficult routes that would be impossible during the summer heat. On the morning of December 18, 2016, a group of climbing instructors from Desert Peak Adventures, a Las Vegas-based outdoor education company, arrived at Red Rock Canyon to conduct an advanced climbing course for 6 students. The lead instructor, 34-year-old Michael Torres, had been guiding climbs in the area for over 8 years and knew the terrain with the familiarity that comes from thousands of hours spent studying rock faces and route possibilities. Torres was known among his colleagues for his meticulous attention to safety and his ability to spot potential hazards or unusual conditions that less experienced climbers might overlook. His students that day included both local residents and visitors from other states, all of whom had completed intermediate climbing courses and were ready to tackle more challenging routes. The group's planned climbing area was located approximately 2 miles northeast of the main Calico Tanks Trail, in a section of canyon where several parallel rock walls create natural corridors between towering sandstone formations. This area was accessible only by hiking cross-country through unmarked desert terrain, following routes known primarily to experienced climbers and desert enthusiasts. The approach required careful navigation between cacti and desert shrubs, over loose rock surfaces, and around obstacles that could easily turn an ankle or cause a fall for anyone not paying close attention to foot placement. Torres had chosen this location specifically because it offered multiple route options at different difficulty levels, allowing him to tailor the day's instruction to each student's abilities. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, while the group was preparing their equipment at the base of a 60-foot sandstone wall, Torres noticed something unusual in his peripheral vision. High above them, caught in the upper branches of a mature Joshua tree that had somehow found purchase in a crack in the rock face, was what appeared to be fabric fluttering in the light desert breeze. Joshua trees are remarkable desert plants, capable of growing in seemingly impossible locations and living for decades or even centuries in the harsh environment. This particular specimen was estimated to be at least 40 years old, its twisted branches reaching nearly 20 feet into the air and extending outward from the cliff face like gnarled fingers. Torres initially assumed the fabric was probably a piece of trash that had been blown by wind from the more heavily traveled areas of the park. Plastic bags, clothing items, and other debris occasionally ended up in unexpected locations throughout the desert, carried by the strong winds that frequently sweep across the open landscape. However, something about the color and texture of the material caught his attention. It was not the bright, artificial appearance of typical litter, but rather a faded, weathered look that suggested it had been exposed to the elements for an extended period. More importantly, the fabric appeared to be substantial enough to have resisted the tearing and shredding that usually occurs when lightweight materials are caught in tree branches for any length of time. Using a pair of binoculars that he carried for route planning and safety assessment, Torres examined the object more carefully. What he saw immediately changed his understanding of the situation. The fabric was clearly part of a clothing item, possibly a shirt or jacket, and it was not simply caught in the branches but appeared to be attached to something larger that was obscured by the dense foliage of the Joshua tree. The way the material hung suggested weight behind it, as if it were connected to a substantial object rather than floating freely. Most disturbing was the realization that the fabric's position, nearly 20 feet above the ground and several feet out from the cliff face, could not be explained by normal wind patterns or accidental loss. Torres immediately called his students together and explained that they needed to postpone the climbing session. He used his satellite communication device, a piece of equipment that climbing guides in remote areas carry for emergency situations, to contact the Clark County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher who received the call initially treated it as a routine report of possible debris, but Torres insisted that the situation required immediate investigation by trained personnel. He emphasized that the location and appearance of the fabric suggested something more serious than casual littering, and that the object's position made it inaccessible to anyone without specialized climbing equipment and training. Within 2 hours, a joint response team consisting of Clark County search and rescue personnel and National Park Service rangers arrived at the location. The team included Detective Raymond Walsh, who had been assigned to Jessica Palmer's missing person case and had maintained familiarity with all ongoing investigations in the Red Rock Canyon area. Walsh had reviewed Jessica's file numerous times over the previous 4 months, hoping to identify some overlooked detail that might provide a new direction for the investigation. When he received the call about fabric found in an unusual location within the general area of Jessica's disappearance, he immediately recognized the potential significance. The recovery operation required careful planning and specialized equipment. The Joshua tree was growing from a narrow ledge on the cliff face, making direct access from below impossible without technical climbing skills. The tree's age and the fragile nature of its root system meant that any recovery effort had to avoid putting stress on the plant itself, both for environmental reasons and to prevent the potential evidence from falling and being damaged. The rescue team's climbing specialist, Officer Janet Kim, had extensive experience in technical rescue operations and had participated in several evidence recovery missions in difficult terrain. Officer Kim established a secure anchor point at the top of the cliff and rappelled down to a position where she could safely approach the Joshua tree. As she drew closer to the fabric, the true nature of the discovery became apparent. What Torres had observed through binoculars was indeed clothing, but it was not simply caught in the branches. The fabric was part of a complete outfit that was still being worn by human remains that had somehow become lodged in the upper portion of the tree. The body was positioned in a way that suggested it had not fallen from directly above, but had instead been placed or had come to rest in the branches through some other mechanism. The initial visual examination revealed that the remains were those of a young woman, consistent with Jessica Palmer's general description. The clothing, while faded and weathered from months of exposure to desert conditions, appeared to match the type of outdoor gear that Jessica had been wearing on the day of her disappearance. More specifically, Officer Kim could see what appeared to be a camera strap still around the neck area, suggesting that this person had been engaged in photography when whatever happened to her occurred. The position of the body, suspended in the tree branches approximately 18 feet above the ground and several feet away from the nearest cliff face, immediately raised questions about how such a placement could have occurred naturally. The recovery process took most of the afternoon, as each step had to be carefully documented and photographed before any evidence was disturbed. Crime scene technicians were called to the location to ensure that proper procedures were followed, even though the circumstances of death were not yet determined. The remote location and the technical difficulty of the recovery meant that a larger team of specialists had to be assembled, including additional climbing experts, forensic photographers, and medical examiner personnel who could properly handle human remains in challenging conditions. As the recovery operation proceeded, Detective Walsh coordinated with the missing persons database to begin the formal identification process. While the location and general circumstances strongly suggested that these were Jessica Palmer's remains, official confirmation would require dental records, DNA analysis, or other definitive identification methods. Walsh also began the process of notifying Jessica's family, though he was careful to explain that positive identification had not yet been completed. The phone call to Jessica's parents in Oregon was one of the most difficult conversations of his career, as he had to balance their need to know about the discovery with the uncertainty that still surrounded the case. The immediate area around the Joshua Tree was thoroughly searched for any additional evidence that might explain how Jessica's body had come to be positioned in such an unusual location. The ground below the tree showed no signs of recent disturbance, and there were no obvious paths or routes that would explain how someone could have reached the tree's location. The cliff face above was examined for any signs that someone might have fallen from a higher elevation, but the rock showed no recent damage or disturbance. Most puzzling was the absence of any of Jessica's equipment in the immediate vicinity. Her camera, backpack, and other gear were nowhere to be found, despite the fact that the camera strap suggested she had been carrying photographic equipment when she died. By evening, Jessica Palmer's remains had been carefully removed from the Joshua Tree and transported to the Clark County Coroner's Office for formal examination. The discovery had answered the fundamental question of what had happened to Jessica, but it had also raised new and more troubling questions about the circumstances of her death. The location where she was found was more than 2 miles from the established trail where she had last been seen alive, in terrain that would have been extremely difficult for someone to navigate alone, especially while carrying camera equipment. Most significantly, the position of her body in the tree branches could not be easily explained by any natural process or accidental fall. The remains recovered from the Joshua Tree were transported to the Clark County Coroner's Office that same evening, where Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Hendricks began the preliminary examination process. Dr. Hendricks had over 15 years of experience with cases involving deaths in desert environments, and she understood the unique challenges that extreme heat, UV exposure, and desert scavengers could present when determining cause and manner of death. The condition of the remains after 4 months of exposure to Nevada's harsh climate meant that traditional autopsy procedures would need to be supplemented with specialized forensic techniques, including detailed skeletal analysis and examination of any preserved soft tissue. The initial external examination confirmed what the recovery team had observed at the scene. The remains were those of a young adult female, consistent with Jessica Palmer's age and general physical description. The clothing, while significantly weathered and faded, matched the type of outdoor hiking attire that Jessica had been wearing according to witness descriptions from the day she disappeared. Most importantly, dental records obtained from Jessica's dentist in Las Vegas provided a positive identification within 48 hours of the discovery. There was no longer any doubt that the remains found in the Joshua Tree belonged to Jessica Palmer, officially closing the missing person case and opening a death investigation. Dr. Hendricks' examination revealed several findings that immediately elevated the case from a potential hiking accident to a suspected homicide. The skeletal remains showed clear evidence of trauma that could not be attributed to environmental factors, animal activity, or accidental injury. Most significantly, there was a distinct fracture pattern on the hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone located in the neck area. This type of fracture is commonly associated with manual strangulation and is considered one of the most reliable indicators of homicidal violence in forensic pathology. The fracture pattern was consistent with sustained pressure applied to the neck area, suggesting that Jessica had been deliberately strangled rather than dying from any accidental cause. Additional skeletal analysis revealed other concerning findings. Several ribs showed hairline fractures that appeared to have occurred around the time of death, suggesting that Jessica had been subjected to significant physical force during her final moments. The pattern and location of these injuries were inconsistent with a fall or other accidental trauma, but were consistent with an assault involving blunt force. Dr. Hendricks noted in her preliminary report that the combination of neck trauma and chest injuries suggested a prolonged struggle, indicating that Jessica had likely fought against her attacker before succumbing to the strangulation. The forensic examination also addressed the puzzling question of how Jessica's body had come to be positioned in the Joshua Tree. Dr. Hendricks' analysis of the remains' positioning and the absence of additional trauma suggested that the body had been placed in the tree after death, rather than falling or being thrown from a height. The careful positioning required to lodge a body securely in tree branches 18 feet above the ground would have required significant planning and physical effort. This finding transformed the case from a murder investigation into something far more complex, suggesting that the perpetrator had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal the body in a location where it might never be discovered. Detective Raymond Walsh, now leading a homicide investigation rather than a missing person case, began the process of re-examining all evidence and witness statements from Jessica's disappearance 4 months earlier. The discovery of her body in such an unusual location, combined with the forensic evidence of homicide, meant that every detail from the original investigation needed to be reconsidered in light of the new information. Walsh requested that the crime scene processing team return to the Joshua Tree location for a more thorough examination, now that they knew they were dealing with a murder scene rather than a potential accident site. The expanded crime scene investigation revealed several pieces of evidence that had been overlooked during the initial recovery operation. Using metal detectors and systematic grid searching, investigators located Jessica's camera equipment scattered in a small ravine approximately 200 yards from the Joshua Tree. The camera body was severely damaged, with the LCD screen shattered and the lens mount broken, suggesting that it had been deliberately destroyed rather than simply dropped. More importantly, the camera's memory card was missing, indicating that someone had specifically removed any photographs that Jessica might have taken on the day she disappeared. The discovery of the damaged camera equipment led investigators to expand their search area even further. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they systematically examined the terrain around the Joshua Tree for any additional evidence that might have been buried or hidden. This expanded search revealed Jessica's backpack, buried under a pile of rocks in a location that would have been invisible to casual observation. The backpack had been deliberately concealed, with the rocks arranged in a pattern that suggested human placement rather than natural accumulation. Inside the buried backpack, investigators found Jessica's wallet, cell phone, and personal items, but several key pieces of equipment were missing. Her tripod, extra camera lenses, and water bottles were never recovered, suggesting that the perpetrator had taken these items either as trophies or to prevent their discovery. Most significantly, Jessica's car keys were found in a zippered pocket of the backpack, confirming that she had indeed taken them with her on the hike as her roommate had suspected. The presence of the keys in the buried backpack indicated that whoever had killed Jessica had made a deliberate decision to leave her car in the parking lot, possibly to delay the discovery of her disappearance. The forensic analysis of Jessica's personal items revealed additional evidence of foul play. Her cell phone showed signs of deliberate damage, with the screen cracked and the internal components exposed to moisture that had caused extensive corrosion. However, digital forensic specialists were able to recover some data from the device's memory, including GPS coordinates that showed Jessica's movement on the morning she disappeared. The GPS data revealed that Jessica had indeed followed the Calico Tanks trail for approximately 1 mile, consistent with witness statements, but then had deviated significantly from the established path. The GPS tracking showed that Jessica had traveled nearly 2 miles into unmarked desert terrain, following a route that would have been extremely difficult for someone unfamiliar with the area to navigate. The path indicated by the GPS data led directly toward the location where her body was eventually found, but it also showed several stops and direction changes that suggested she had not been traveling alone. The pattern of movement was inconsistent with someone who was lost or confused, but rather suggested someone who was being directed or forced to travel to a specific destination. Detective Walsh realized that the GPS data provided the first concrete evidence that Jessica had encountered someone else during her hike. The route she had taken was far too complex and purposeful for someone who was simply exploring or seeking photographic opportunities. More importantly, the final GPS coordinates, recorded just minutes before the phone stopped transmitting, placed Jessica at a location approximately half a mile from where her body was found. This gap in the tracking data suggested that her phone had been deliberately disabled at that point, and that her final movements had been controlled by someone who understood the importance of eliminating electronic evidence. The investigation team began developing a profile of the perpetrator based on the evidence recovered from the crime scene and the forensic analysis of Jessica's remains. The killer had demonstrated significant knowledge of the Red Rock Canyon area, including familiarity with remote locations that were not accessible to casual visitors. The deliberate concealment of evidence, including the burial of Jessica's backpack and the destruction of her camera equipment, suggested someone with experience in covering up criminal activity. Most importantly, the physical effort required to position Jessica's body in the Joshua Tree indicated someone with considerable strength and possibly technical climbing skills. Detective Walsh expanded the investigation to include a review of all permits and registrations for the Red Rock Canyon area during the time period around Jessica's disappearance. This included climbing permits, research authorizations, and commercial guide licenses, as well as employment records for anyone who worked in the area on a regular basis. The theory was that Jessica's killer was likely someone who had legitimate reasons to be in the remote areas of the canyon, and who would not have attracted attention from park rangers or other visitors. The permit review revealed several individuals who had been authorized to work in the Red Rock Canyon area during August 2016, including research scientists, climbing guides, and maintenance personnel. Each of these individuals became a potential suspect who would need to be interviewed and investigated. Detective Walsh also requested employment records from all companies that provided services in the area, including tour operators, equipment rental businesses, and outdoor education programs. The goal was to identify anyone who had both the knowledge and opportunity to encounter Jessica in the remote location where she was killed. As the investigation progressed, Detective Walsh became increasingly convinced that Jessica's murder was not a random crime of opportunity, but rather a planned attack by someone who had specifically targeted her. The complexity of the crime scene, the deliberate concealment of evidence, and the sophisticated knowledge required to navigate the remote desert terrain all suggested a perpetrator who had carefully planned the attack. This realization meant that the investigation would need to focus not just on who had the opportunity to kill Jessica, but on who might have had a motive to target her specifically. The case had evolved from a missing person investigation to a complex homicide case that would require extensive resources and specialized expertise to solve. Detective Walsh knew that the unusual circumstances of the crime, particularly the positioning of the body in the Joshua Tree, meant that they were dealing with a killer who was both physically capable and psychologically disturbed. The challenge would be identifying this individual from among the many people who had legitimate access to the Red Rock Canyon area, and building a case strong enough to secure a conviction for Jessica Palmer's murder. If you're finding this investigation as compelling as we are, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates as we continue to uncover the truth behind Jessica's tragic death. The investigation into Jessica Palmer's murder took a significant turn when Detective Walsh decided to examine the employment records of all personnel who had worked in the Red Rock Canyon area during the summer of 2016. This comprehensive review included not only Park Service employees and licensed tour guides, but also contract workers, maintenance staff, and anyone else who might have had regular access to the remote areas where Jessica's body was discovered. The process was time-consuming and required coordination with multiple agencies, but Walsh understood that the killer's familiarity with the terrain suggested someone who spent considerable time in the area for professional reasons. Among the dozens of names that emerged from this review, one individual immediately caught Detective Walsh's attention. Robert Crane, a 35-year-old freelance wilderness photographer and part-time climbing guide, had been working in the Red Rock Canyon area throughout the summer of 2016. Crane held multiple permits that allowed him access to restricted areas of the park for both commercial photography work and guide services. His background check revealed a clean criminal record, but several former clients had filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau regarding his unprofessional behavior and inappropriate comments during guided tours. More significantly, Crane's permit applications showed that he had been authorized to work in the exact area where Jessica's body was found during the week of her disappearance. Detective Walsh's initial research into Robert Crane revealed a pattern of behavior that raised immediate red flags. Crane had been operating his photography and guide business for nearly 5 years, but his client reviews showed a disturbing trend of negative interactions, particularly with female customers. Several women had reported feeling uncomfortable during private photography sessions, citing Crane's tendency to make personal comments about their appearance and his insistence on conducting shoots in isolated locations far from established trails. While none of these complaints had risen to the level of criminal charges, they painted a picture of someone who used his professional access to the wilderness to place himself in situations where he could interact with vulnerable individuals. The detective's investigation into Crane's background revealed additional concerning information. Crane lived alone in a small apartment in Henderson, Nevada, approximately 30 minutes from Red Rock Canyon. He had no steady employment beyond his freelance work, and his financial records showed irregular income that barely covered his basic expenses. More importantly, Crane's social media profiles and online photography portfolios showed an obsessive focus on photographing young women in outdoor settings. His website featured dozens of images of female models posed against desert landscapes, often in revealing clothing and isolated locations that emphasized their vulnerability against the harsh environment. Detective Walsh decided to conduct surveillance on Robert Crane before approaching him directly for questioning. This decision was based on the understanding that if Crane was indeed Jessica's killer, a premature interview might cause him to destroy evidence or flee the area. The surveillance team observed Crane's daily routines for several days, noting that he spent most of his time either at his apartment or driving to various locations throughout the Red Rock Canyon area. His vehicle, a modified Jeep Wrangler equipped with climbing gear and photography equipment, was frequently seen parked at remote trailheads and service roads that were not accessible to ordinary tourists. During the surveillance period, investigators observed Crane's interactions with several female clients who had hired him for photography sessions. The surveillance team noted that Crane consistently led these clients to isolated locations far from established trails, often requiring hikes of several miles through difficult terrain. His behavior during these sessions appeared professional from a distance, but the investigators noted that he seemed to prefer working with young women who were visiting the area alone or with minimal companions. This pattern was consistent with someone who was actively seeking opportunities to isolate potential victims in remote locations. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Walsh decided to examine Crane's vehicle more closely. Using a telephoto lens during one of the surveillance sessions, investigators were able to photograph the interior of Crane's Jeep when he left it unlocked during a photography session. The images revealed several items that immediately connected Crane to Jessica Palmer's murder. Most significantly, investigators could see what appeared to be a professional camera tripod in the back of the vehicle that matched the description of equipment that Jessica had been carrying but which had never been recovered from the crime scene. Armed with this evidence, Detective Walsh obtained a search warrant for Robert Crane's apartment and vehicle. The search was conducted early in the morning when Crane was at home, allowing investigators to arrest him before he could destroy any potential evidence. Crane appeared surprised by the arrival of the police, but his initial reaction suggested guilt rather than innocent confusion. When Detective Walsh informed him that he was being arrested in connection with the murder of Jessica Palmer, Crane immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any questions about his activities during August 2016. The search of Crane's apartment revealed a disturbing collection of evidence that linked him directly to Jessica's murder. In a closet in his bedroom, investigators found Jessica's missing camera lenses, still in their original cases with her name written on the identification labels. Hidden behind a false panel in his desk, they discovered Jessica's memory card from her camera, along with several other memory cards that appeared to belong to different cameras. Most damning was the discovery of a detailed journal in which Crane had recorded his observations of various women he had encountered during his work in the desert, including a detailed description of Jessica Palmer that had been written several days before her disappearance. The journal entries revealed that Crane had been systematically stalking women who visited Red Rock Canyon for photography purposes. His writings showed that he had developed an elaborate system for identifying potential victims, following them to remote locations, and planning attacks that would be difficult to investigate. The entry about Jessica Palmer was particularly detailed, describing her equipment, her apparent skill level, and his assessment of her as someone who would be likely to venture into isolated areas alone. Most chilling was his notation that Jessica would be an ideal target because she was visiting from out of state and would not be immediately missed if she disappeared. The search of Crane's Jeep provided additional physical evidence linking him to the crime. Forensic technicians found traces of Jessica's DNA on the passenger seat and door handles, indicating that she had been inside the vehicle at some point. More significantly, they discovered climbing rope and hardware that could have been used to position Jessica's body in the Joshua tree. The rope showed microscopic fibers that matched the bark pattern of Joshua trees, and the hardware included specialized anchors that would have been necessary to secure a rope system capable of lifting a body to the height where Jessica was found. Detective Walsh's interrogation strategy focused on presenting the overwhelming physical evidence while giving Crane opportunities to explain his possession of Jessica's equipment and the presence of her DNA in his vehicle. However, Crane maintained his silence and continued to request legal representation. His lawyer, when finally contacted, advised him to refuse all questioning until a formal plea agreement could be negotiated. This response suggested that Crane understood the strength of the evidence against him and was hoping to avoid the death penalty through cooperation with prosecutors. The investigation team continued to build their case by examining Crane's activities during the specific time period when Jessica disappeared. Cell phone tower records showed that Crane's phone had been active in the Red Rock Canyon area on August 12, 2016, the day Jessica was last seen alive. More specifically, the tower data indicated that his phone had traveled along a route that closely matched the GPS coordinates recovered from Jessica's damaged phone. This electronic evidence provided a timeline that placed Crane in the exact location where Jessica had been killed, at the precise time when her phone stopped transmitting data. Forensic analysis of the memory cards found in Crane's apartment revealed the most disturbing evidence in the case. The cards contained hundreds of photographs that Crane had taken of women without their knowledge, including images that appeared to have been captured using telephoto lenses from concealed positions. Several of the photographs showed women in vulnerable situations, including some who appeared to be lost or in distress in remote desert locations. Most significantly, one of the memory cards contained photographs of Jessica Palmer that had been taken on the morning of her disappearance, showing her hiking alone along the Calico Tanks Trail. The photographs of Jessica provided crucial evidence about the timeline of her murder and Crane's method of operation. The images showed that Crane had been following Jessica for some time before approaching her, documenting her movements and waiting for an opportunity when she was completely isolated from other hikers. The final photographs on the memory card showed Jessica in the remote area where her body was eventually found, but the images had been taken from a distance that suggested Crane was stalking her rather than interacting with her openly. Detective Walsh realized that the photographic evidence demonstrated premeditation and planning that elevated the case from a crime of opportunity to first-degree murder. Crane had not simply encountered Jessica by chance and killed her in a moment of impulse. Instead, he had deliberately targeted her, followed her into the wilderness, and executed a plan that he had clearly developed through previous experience with other victims. The journal entries and photographic evidence suggested that Jessica Palmer might not have been Crane's first victim, and that other missing person cases in the area might need to be re-examined in light of this new evidence. The case against Robert Crane was becoming overwhelming, but Detective Walsh knew that securing a conviction would require more than just physical evidence. The prosecution would need to demonstrate not only that Crane had killed Jessica Palmer, but that he had done so with premeditation and deliberate cruelty. The positioning of her body in the Joshua Tree, the destruction of her camera equipment, and the careful concealment of evidence all suggested a killer who had taken pleasure in the complexity of his crime and the challenge of avoiding detection. The formal charges against Robert Crane were filed 3 days after his arrest, following a comprehensive review of the evidence by the Clark County District Attorney's Office. Crane was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence in connection with Jessica Palmer's death. The kidnapping charge was based on the GPS evidence showing that Jessica had been forced to travel nearly 2 miles from her last known location to the area where she was killed. The tampering charge covered his deliberate destruction of her camera equipment and the concealment of her personal belongings. District Attorney Margaret Foster announced at a press conference that her office would seek the death penalty, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the exceptional cruelty demonstrated by the positioning of Jessica's body in the Joshua Tree. The investigation expanded significantly once Crane was in custody, as Detective Walsh began examining whether Jessica Palmer might have been part of a larger pattern of crimes. The disturbing collection of photographs found in Crane's apartment, combined with his detailed journal entries about stalking women in the desert, suggested that he had been operating as a predator for an extended period. Walsh coordinated with law enforcement agencies throughout Nevada, Arizona, and California to review unsolved missing person cases involving young women who had disappeared while hiking or camping in remote desert areas. This expanded investigation revealed several cases that bore striking similarities to Jessica's murder. In 2014, a 26-year-old landscape painter named Rebecca Torres had disappeared while working on a series of desert paintings in Joshua Tree National Park in California. Her car had been found in a parking area, but despite extensive searches, her body was never recovered. Like Jessica, Rebecca had been working alone in a remote area and had been carrying valuable art supplies that were never found. More significantly, cell phone records showed that Rebecca's phone had stopped transmitting data in an area where Robert Crane had been conducting photography workshops during the same time period. Another case that caught Detective Walsh's attention involved the 2015 disappearance of 24-year-old geology student Karen Mitchell, who had vanished while conducting field research in the Valley of Fire State Park, also in Nevada. Karen's research equipment had been found scattered across a wide area, suggesting that someone had deliberately destroyed and dispersed her materials. Her body was eventually discovered 6 months later in a location that required technical climbing skills to access, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental death. The similarities to Jessica's case were too numerous to be coincidental, and Walsh suspected that Crane might have been responsible for Karen's death as well. The investigation into these potential additional victims required careful coordination with multiple jurisdictions and agencies. Detective Walsh worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to develop a comprehensive profile of Crane's criminal behavior and to identify other cases that might fit his pattern of operation. The FBI analysts noted that Crane's method of targeting women who were engaged in solitary creative or academic work in remote locations was highly specific and suggested a killer who was motivated by both sexual violence and a desire to destroy the victim's professional aspirations. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of evidence from Jessica's case continued to yield new information. DNA testing of trace materials found in Crane's vehicle revealed the presence of genetic material from at least 3 different individuals, including Jessica Palmer. The other DNA profiles were entered into national databases in an attempt to identify additional victims, but initial searches did not produce matches with known missing persons. However, the presence of multiple DNA sources in Crane's vehicle strongly suggested that Jessica was not his only victim. The most significant development in the expanded investigation came when Detective Walsh received a call from a retired park ranger named Thomas Bradley, who had worked in the Red Rock Canyon area for over 20 years before retiring in 2015. Bradley had read about Crane's arrest in the newspaper and contacted the sheriff's department because he remembered several suspicious encounters with Crane during his final years of service. According to Bradley, Crane had been involved in at least 3 incidents where female hikers had reported feeling threatened or followed by a man matching his description. Bradley's records, which he had maintained in personal files after his retirement, documented these incidents in detail. In 2013, a college student from Utah had reported that a man with a camera had followed her for several miles along a remote trail, taking photographs without her permission and refusing to leave her alone when she asked him to stop. The woman had been able to reach a more populated area and report the incident, but no formal charges were filed because she could not provide a definitive identification of her stalker. However, her description of the man and his vehicle closely matched Robert Crane and his Jeep. Another incident from Bradley's files involved a professional photographer from Colorado who had hired Crane as a guide for a commercial shoot in 2014. The woman had terminated the contract after one day because Crane had insisted on taking her to increasingly isolated locations and had made inappropriate comments about her appearance. She had also reported that Crane seemed more interested in photographing her than in helping with her professional work. Most disturbing was her observation that Crane had detailed knowledge of remote areas that were not marked on any official maps, suggesting that he had spent considerable time exploring locations where criminal activity would be unlikely to be discovered. The third incident documented by Bradley was perhaps the most significant. In early 2015, a young woman from Las Vegas had reported that she had been approached by a man claiming to be a professional photographer who offered to take her portrait in a scenic desert location. The woman had agreed to meet Crane at a trailhead, but had become suspicious when he insisted on hiking to an extremely remote area that required several hours of difficult travel. She had made an excuse to return to her car and had driven away, but not before noting Crane's license plate number. Bradley had investigated the incident and had issued Crane a warning about his conduct, but no formal charges were filed because no actual crime had been committed. These historical incidents provided crucial context for understanding Crane's pattern of behavior and his method of selecting victims. Detective Walsh realized that Crane had been refining his approach over several years, learning from encounters that did not result in successful attacks and gradually developing more sophisticated methods of isolating potential victims. The progression from following women without permission to offering professional services as a way of gaining their trust showed a predator who was becoming increasingly dangerous over time. The investigation team also discovered that Crane had been using multiple online identities to advertise his photography services and to make contact with potential victims. His various websites and social media profiles presented him as an experienced wilderness photographer and guide, but careful analysis revealed that many of his claimed credentials were fabricated or exaggerated. More importantly, his online communications with potential clients showed a pattern of trying to arrange meetings with young women who were new to the area and unfamiliar with desert safety protocols. Detective Walsh's review of Crane's online activities revealed that he had been in contact with Jessica Palmer several weeks before her disappearance. The communications had been conducted through a photography forum where Jessica had posted questions about the best locations for landscape photography in the Las Vegas area. Crane had responded to her posts with helpful suggestions and had eventually offered to provide her with detailed information about remote locations that were not well known to tourists. While Jessica had not taken him up on his offer to serve as a guide, the communications showed that Crane had been aware of her plans to visit Red Rock Canyon and had specifically recommended the areas where she was eventually killed. This discovery transformed the prosecution's understanding of the case from a random encounter to a carefully planned attack. Crane had not simply happened upon Jessica while she was hiking alone. He had deliberately targeted her based on their online interactions and had used his knowledge of her plans to position himself where he could intercept her. The premeditation evident in this approach strengthened the case for first-degree murder and supported the prosecution's decision to seek the death penalty. As the investigation continued, Detective Walsh began working with victim advocacy groups to reach out to other women who might have had concerning encounters with Robert Crane. The publicity surrounding his arrest prompted several additional women to come forward with reports of suspicious behavior, inappropriate comments, and situations where they had felt threatened during interactions with Crane. While none of these incidents had resulted in physical violence, they provided additional evidence of Crane's predatory behavior and his systematic approach to targeting vulnerable women in isolated locations. The mounting evidence against Robert Crane painted a picture of a serial predator who had been operating in the desert Southwest for several years, using his legitimate access to remote areas as cover for increasingly violent criminal behavior. Jessica Palmer appeared to be his most recent victim, but the investigation suggested that she was part of a larger pattern of violence that had been escalating over time. Detective Walsh knew that building a comprehensive case against Crane would require not only proving his guilt in Jessica's murder, but also demonstrating the full scope of his criminal activities to ensure that he could never harm another woman. The case was becoming one of the most complex and significant criminal investigations in Clark County's recent history, with implications that extended far beyond Jessica Palmer's individual tragedy. The discovery of Crane's systematic predatory behavior highlighted the vulnerabilities faced by women who pursued outdoor activities alone, and raised important questions about how law enforcement agencies could better protect people who chose to explore remote natural areas. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the disturbing details of this case and follow the legal proceedings that will determine Robert Crane's fate. The trial of Robert Crane began on September 15, 2017, in the Clark County District Court, presided over by Judge Patricia Reynolds. The case had attracted significant media attention throughout Nevada and the broader Southwest, both because of the unusual circumstances of Jessica Palmer's murder and because of the evidence suggesting that Crane had been responsible for multiple disappearances over several years. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and members of Jessica's family, who had traveled from Oregon to witness the proceedings. District Attorney Margaret Foster led the prosecution team, while Crane was represented by veteran defense attorney David Kellner, who had built his reputation defending clients in high-profile murder cases. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a comprehensive timeline of Crane's predatory behavior, beginning with his earliest documented encounters with female hikers and culminating in Jessica Palmer's murder. Foster emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, highlighting the online communications between Crane and Jessica that showed he had been aware of her plans weeks before her disappearance. She described how Crane had used his legitimate credentials as a photographer and guide to gain access to remote areas where he could stalk and attack vulnerable women without fear of discovery. Most importantly, she explained how the physical evidence, including Jessica's DNA in Crane's vehicle and her personal belongings found in his apartment, provided irrefutable proof of his guilt. The defense strategy, as outlined in Kellner's opening statement, focused on challenging the prosecution's timeline and suggesting that the evidence against Crane had been circumstantial rather than definitive. Kellner argued that his client's possession of Jessica's equipment could be explained by his discovery of her body during one of his routine photography expeditions, and that his failure to report the discovery was due to panic rather than guilt. He suggested that the real killer remained at large, and that Crane had become a convenient scapegoat for law enforcement agencies under pressure to solve a high-profile case. However, this defense strategy faced significant challenges given the overwhelming amount of physical and digital evidence linking Crane to the crime. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Jessica's roommate Amanda, who described Jessica's careful planning for her photography expedition and her consistent pattern of safety-conscious behavior during previous hiking trips. Amanda's testimony established that Jessica would never have voluntarily traveled to the remote location where her body was found, and that she would have contacted someone if she had encountered any problems during her hike. The emotional impact of Amanda's testimony was evident throughout the courtroom, as she described the last conversation she had with Jessica and her growing concern when Jessica failed to return as planned. Detective Raymond Walsh's testimony formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, as he methodically walked the jury through the investigation from Jessica's initial disappearance to the discovery of her body and the subsequent identification of Robert Crane as the primary suspect. Walsh explained how the unusual positioning of Jessica's body in the Joshua tree had immediately suggested foul play, and how the forensic evidence had gradually built a comprehensive picture of Crane's involvement in the crime. His testimony included detailed explanations of the GPS data from Jessica's phone, the DNA evidence found in Crane's vehicle, and the significance of the personal belongings discovered in Crane's apartment. The forensic evidence presented during the trial was particularly damaging to Crane's defense. Dr. Patricia Hendricks testified about her examination of Jessica's remains, explaining how the fracture patterns in the hyoid bone and ribs indicated that Jessica had been strangled and beaten before her death. Her testimony made clear that Jessica's injuries could not have been caused by any accidental fall or animal attack, and that the positioning of her body in the tree required deliberate human intervention. The medical examiner's calm, professional presentation of this evidence had a profound impact on the jury, as it eliminated any possibility that Jessica's death had been anything other than murder. The digital forensics evidence proved equally compelling. Technology specialist Officer Maria Santos testified about the recovery of data from Jessica's damaged phone, including the GPS coordinates that tracked her movement from the established trail to the remote location where she was killed. Santos explained how the data showed that Jessica had not been lost or confused, but had been directed along a specific route that led directly to the area where Crane was known to operate. The abrupt termination of the GPS tracking coincided exactly with the time when Jessica's phone stopped transmitting, suggesting that her killer had deliberately disabled the device to prevent further tracking. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence presented during the trial was the collection of photographs and journal entries found in Crane's apartment. The prosecution displayed selected images that showed Crane had been systematically stalking women in desert locations for several years, documenting their movements and vulnerabilities without their knowledge. The journal entries revealed Crane's detailed planning process, including his assessment of potential victims and his strategies for isolating them in remote locations. The entry about Jessica Palmer, written days before her disappearance, demonstrated clear premeditation and showed that Crane had specifically targeted her based on their online interactions. The testimony of retired park ranger Thomas Bradley provided crucial context about Crane's pattern of behavior over several years. Bradley described the multiple incidents where women had reported feeling threatened or followed by a man matching Crane's description, and explained how these reports had gradually escalated from simple harassment to more aggressive stalking behavior. His testimony helped the jury understand that Jessica's murder was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of increasingly violent predatory behavior. The prosecution also called several women who had survived encounters with Robert Crane, including the Colorado photographer who had terminated her contract with him after feeling threatened during a commercial shoot. These witnesses described Crane's inappropriate behavior, his insistence on traveling to extremely isolated locations, and his apparent obsession with photographing women in vulnerable situations. Their testimony painted a picture of a predator who had been refining his methods over time, learning from unsuccessful attempts and gradually developing more sophisticated approaches to targeting potential victims. The defense's case was significantly hampered by Crane's decision not to testify on his own behalf. Kellner called several character witnesses who testified about Crane's professional reputation and his apparent lack of violent tendencies, but these testimonies were undermined by the overwhelming physical evidence and the documented pattern of predatory behavior. The defense's attempts to suggest alternative explanations for the evidence were systematically dismantled by the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses, who demonstrated that Crane's possession of Jessica's belongings and the presence of her DNA in his vehicle could not be explained by any innocent encounter. The closing arguments took place over 2 days, with both sides presenting comprehensive summaries of their cases. District Attorney Foster's closing argument emphasized the systematic nature of Crane's predatory behavior and the overwhelming evidence of his guilt in Jessica's murder. She described how Crane had used his legitimate access to remote desert areas to stalk and kill vulnerable women, and how Jessica Palmer had become his victim through a combination of careful planning and opportunistic violence. Foster's presentation was methodical and emotionally powerful, as she walked the jury through each piece of evidence and explained how it contributed to an irrefutable case against the defendant. Defense attorney Kellner's closing argument focused on raising doubts about the prosecution's timeline and suggesting that the evidence against his client was circumstantial rather than conclusive. However, his arguments were weakened by the sheer volume of physical evidence and the clear documentation of Crane's predatory behavior over several years. The defense's suggestion that Crane had simply discovered Jessica's body and panicked was contradicted by the forensic evidence showing that her belongings had been deliberately concealed and her camera equipment destroyed. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Crane's guilt in Jessica Palmer's murder. When the verdict was read, Jessica's family members wept with relief, while Crane showed no visible emotion. The conviction on first-degree murder charges meant that Crane would face either life in prison without parole or the death penalty, depending on the outcome of the penalty phase of the trial. The penalty phase proceedings focused on the aggravating and mitigating factors that would determine Crane's ultimate sentence. The prosecution presented evidence of the exceptional cruelty involved in Jessica's murder, including the deliberate positioning of her body in the Joshua Tree and the systematic destruction of her personal belongings. They also presented evidence suggesting that Crane had been responsible for additional murders, including the disappearances of Rebecca Torres and Karen Mitchell, though he had not been formally charged in those cases. The defense presented mitigating evidence about Crane's difficult childhood and his struggles with mental health issues, but these factors were overshadowed by the calculated nature of his crimes and the evidence of his systematic predatory behavior. After 2 days of penalty phase proceedings, the jury recommended the death penalty, citing the premeditated nature of the murder and the exceptional cruelty demonstrated by Crane's actions. Judge Reynolds formally sentenced Robert Crane to death on November 3, 2017, nearly 15 months after Jessica Palmer's body had been discovered in the Joshua Tree. In her sentencing statement, Judge Reynolds described the crime as one of the most disturbing cases she had encountered in her judicial career, noting that Crane had used his knowledge of the desert environment to create a perfect hunting ground for stalking and killing innocent women. She emphasized that the death penalty was appropriate given the calculated nature of the crime and the evidence suggesting that Crane would continue to pose a threat to public safety if he were ever released. The conclusion of Robert Crane's trial brought a measure of closure to Jessica Palmer's family and friends, though it could never fully heal the wounds caused by her senseless murder. Jessica's father established a foundation in her memory to promote safety education for women who pursue outdoor activities alone, while her former professors at the University of Nevada created a scholarship program for students studying environmental photography. The case also led to improved safety protocols at Red Rock Canyon and other national parks, including better screening procedures for commercial guides and enhanced communication systems for solo hikers. Detective Raymond Walsh, reflecting on the case years later, noted that Jessica Palmer's murder had highlighted the vulnerabilities faced by women who chose to explore remote natural areas alone. The investigation had revealed how predators like Robert Crane could exploit legitimate access to wilderness areas to stalk and attack victims in locations where crimes were unlikely to be discovered. The case served as a reminder that even in the apparent safety of national parks and conservation areas, vigilance and proper safety precautions remained essential for anyone venturing into the wilderness alone.